We are back here on the Chip Shot Football Podcast to continue to talk about the fallout from the Super Bowl a little bit, focusing more so on the Eagles right in today's show. And I see the questions coming in, so we will address some or all of them, I'll say. Anthony, I don't think the Eagles are the next dynasty. I think that's still going to be the Chiefs. I think this is just an outlier. I mean, that's fair. The who was it? The Patriots, right? Obviously, they won a couple, and they didn't get a three-peat, so they were still in the middle of their dynasty. So I can see that point, and I mean the Chiefs are going to be there, right? So it's not like they're just done, and the Eagles are now just going to take over that spot, right? They're still probably going to have to see the Chiefs, I would imagine, at least one more time in the next 2 to 3 years. So that point's fair. But also, Anthony says I think he's still in the same area. He's a good or great quarterback that can give you playoff wins and Super Bowls, but I don't think he's in that stratosphere. I think Hurts needs to have everything perfect around him to win a Super Bowl, and I think that's what happened this season with the Eagles. Yeah, I mean, it's it's an interesting question, and that leads us perfectly into this segment, right? Because, the Eagles, especially Jalen Hurts, I feel like shut a lot of people up on Sunday, again, with a dominant Super Bowl win, and a win that saw him, get the Super Bowl MVP and stuff like that. And while most of this season is going to be predicated and, celebrated with Saquon in mind and the kind of historical season that he had, I think Jalen does get overlooked in a sense, right? Because I feel like he played some of the cleanest, most efficient football that most quarterbacks, or that I've seen really out of most quarterbacks this season. And Jalen Hurts, over the last few seasons, including this one, he's the only other player other than Tom Brady with at least 3 scores and a 70% completion percentage in multiple Super Bowls. Philadelphia is 43-13 in his starts since 2022, including playoffs, and he did throw an interception in the Super Bowl, which was his first turnover since November 10th versus the Dallas Cowboys. He finished this season with 32 total touchdowns and 5 interceptions this year. So, like I said, I mean, stuff that really won't show up, because the way that people, measure winning and measure success, it all kind of depends on what we're talking about when we're discussing, topics like this, right? Is Jalen Hurts now a top 5, top 4 quarterback potentially in the NFL? You can make a bunch of arguments. I would say, like, is he the most talented and maybe the most spectacular? Probably not. If, Patrick's going to be in there, obviously he's probably the overall one, definitely is. And then if you want to talk about spectacular and just natural ability, Lamar's probably up there ahead of Jalen. Josh obviously also can make an argument to be up there. So when you're talking about just talented and, just skill-based quarterbacks, that is something that probably you can make a solid argument for those other guys, right? But when you're measuring winning, right, and that it seems like the ring chasing culture, I guess you could say, and how people usually measure success is with championships, right? And Jalen now has that over most of those other guys, right? In his 4 seasons as a starter, he's already been to 2 Super Bowls, and he's won one already, something that guys like Lamar and Josh Allen can't say the same. And even Joe Burrow, right? He's made it to the Super Bowl, but he hasn't actually won one, and he's only been to 1 thus far, whereas Jalen, 50% of his career, he's made it to the Super Bowl, right? So that's also something that you can take into account when you're measuring it based on success, on wins, and on Super Bowls, obviously, right? Was Tom Brady the most talented, most skill-based, just natural ability? Probably not. A lot of people would probably say like Rodgers or, a bunch of other guys ahead of Tom, but was he the most successful? And he's obviously viewed as the GOAT. I'm not saying Jalen's going to get to that status or anything like that, but, when we're talking about success and the quarterbacks that you really remember and hold to the highest esteem, I think you got to now look at Jalen a little bit differently, right? Because he was able to, yes, bring this all-star, perfect to some extent level team to the Super Bowl. But I think that with how important the quarterback is and how vital that position really is, right? If say, right, you got a perfect team like the Minnesota Vikings, I think is a great example, right? They had almost a perfect team, right? When you look at Justin Jefferson, Aaron Jones, pretty decent O-line, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, a defense that was playing pretty well throughout the majority of the season, but the quarterback just decides to drop a goose egg in some of the most important games. You can see how that really just turns everything into dust very quickly, right? With Sam, it's hard not to put a lot of the blame on him, and it's hard for someone like me, I guess, to not directly look at Sam as the main culprit, right? Because everything else seems to be everything a quarterback could ask for, right? And the only difference this year seems to be that quarterback position. So for Sam to kind of dwindle down in those moments, you can see how if the quarterback still isn't holding up his end of the bargain, very talented teams like the Vikings can crumble just like that and look like they don't even belong in the playoffs, right? The Lions are another team, right, with Jared Goff throwing a couple interceptions, and they don't necessarily get blown out like the Chiefs did, but they gave up a whole lot more points than anybody could have given the Commanders credit for as the number one seed as well. So I feel like kind of selling Jalen short on that end just because the rest of his team is great, right? And they're built very like perfect, right? It seems like I don't think that should be so much of a knock on Jalen, because if he was actually like a really sorry quarterback and he just was obviously being carried by this team, I think it would definitely show and be exposed to some extent, right, at some point during the playoffs. But I think enhancing everybody else and keeping this thing going and, game managing the situation in a lot of these games, I think that holds a lot of merit. And they found their way all the way to the Super Bowl and ended up winning it in the end over a team where they have a better quarterback, right? A lot of people, and I would agree that Patrick is the better quarterback, but on the stage yesterday and to some extent in their first meeting in the Super Bowl, a lot of people will say that Jalen outplayed Patrick both times. But obviously Patrick won the first Super Bowl, and that's something everybody remembers. And now this time, Jalen outplayed him, and he also won the Super Bowl and got himself an MVP. So I think by that standard and by that measuring stick, you got to look at Jalen a little bit differently. Because now I mentioned he's made it to two Super Bowls in his 4 seasons, and not including Patrick, but the other quarterbacks don't have that efficient of a winning rate when it comes to some of the biggest moments in the playoffs and when you're really coming down towards the end of the season, right? Joe Burrow has been to a Super Bowl, like I mentioned before. He's also beaten Patrick on the road as well, right? It's only Joe, Jalen now, and Tom that have beaten Patrick in the playoffs. And you look at the other guys, not to diminish them either, but Lamar has 2 MVPs, which is a fantastic thing to do. He probably could have had 3 already, but it went to Josh. And with those 2 MVPs, he also has a 3-5 playoff record, right? So that's not a positive thing to kind of boast about. And he's only been to 1 conference championship, and he has no wins against the Kansas City Chiefs in the playoffs. So that also kind of hangs over your head, right? You keep running into the same person, the same opponent, and you just can't get it done. And the same thing, the same thing can be said about Josh Allen, right? He just won his MVP, well-deserved. He carried his team this season in a season where a lot of people felt that they were going to regress and not even be close to what they were, and they made it back to the conference championship, not only defeating Lamar and the Bills, but having a remarkable season. He had a lot of remarkable moments, a lot of remarkable games that we'll remember this season. But he's 0-4 against Patrick in the playoffs, right? And he's got no Super Bowl appearances. So, yes, again, those quarterbacks have a lot to be celebrated on, right? And when you're comparing them, it's hard to split hairs here, obviously. But I think with Jalen holding what is looked at as the ultimate prize and the ultimate, end goal, I think he's kind of... Would I put him ahead of all those other guys? Maybe not. Or maybe I might put him ahead of... Oh, it's so hard to say. I don't want to like just say something outlandish, right? I would put him in the same conversation as Josh. I would say him and Josh are very similar. Would any of these quarterbacks in this similar scenario as Jalen is right now, is Lamar on the Eagles, and does he still have no Super Bowls? Probably not, right? He might have at least one by now, right? And Josh, is he having a Super Bowl with this Eagles team if he had this kind of roster? Potentially, right? I mean, you look at Jalen, and he doesn't have to get through Patrick Mahomes each and every season, right? That's a huge thing to talk about, right? And the defense this year also played out of their minds, but also to kind of still back up my point, just to provide those opposing views, I think Jalen, for the kind of narrative that has been made of him and how the passing game, and a lot of people doubted the passing game, how they just never felt Jalen could kind of rise to the occasion when it was called upon. This Kansas City Chiefs defense was a very good unit all throughout this year, and Jalen and that offensive line, played them very well. And Jalen made a lot of great throws, a lot of great plays with his legs. Right, he never really got into a spot where he looked panicked or anything like that. Other than that one interception, everything else from him was flawless. And does he benefit, again from playing in the NFC and stuff like that, and not having to play the Chiefs a bunch of times, like I said before? Yes, that is a huge thing, right? Because in the NFC, there's no Patrick, there's no Lamar, right? That's obviously a huge thing. But overall, I think Jalen, to actually go and do it, right? It always seems easy when you just mention and talk about it, right? But to actually go out there and beat the closest thing that people have seen to Tom Brady and this Chiefs team that was chasing history, that definitely holds a lot of merit from my point of view. So I would probably include him now as I would say like as a top four quarterback, right? It's hard for me to put him over Patrick, obviously. And I mean, I'm thinking about it now. I mean, is Joe a better passer, has more ability potentially than Jalen? Yes, but has he been able to get to the Super Bowl, right? And has this team been able to win those big games, right? A lot of people would say no, and I think I'm inching towards that. So I think Jalen has now entered in a conversation where you can mention him with Joe, with Josh, and maybe not Lamar to an extent, just because Lamar is something different that we really haven't seen too much of. But I think you can start including him with Joe and Jalen, and excuse me, Josh, a little bit more, especially like we just talked about in the last segment. If they come back and do it again, right, there's really no choice but to kind of even boost him up a little bit more. But that's still a long ways away, right? But I think Jalen should be getting a lot of credit. He played an exceptional game, and that it's a very subjective topic, right? But from what I saw yesterday, where Jalen could have easily been rattled in such a big moment like that, dealing with the pressure of having this second opportunity. He was calm, cool, and collected as he always is, and he got the job done. So, yeah, I think I look at Jalen a little bit differently now than I did on Saturday, definitely. But that's just my point of view. We still got a long time to go. He's still only 26, so we'll see where he ends up in a couple years. But for right now, we're going to move on and start talking about some free agency talk, some off-season discussions, one of the best times of the years, I would say. So our first topic on that subject is in the wide receiver market, looking at Davante Adams. It looks like, according to some reports, Davante Adams is intrigued about the opportunity of going back out west and joining a team out west, leaving the New York Jets potentially this offseason and joining another new team this upcoming season. So we'll discuss who those teams are and the best fit potentially for Davante Adams when we return after this break.